14. Originally a British magazine, it was purchased and brought stateside by the magnate Condé Nast, who wanted a publication that would celebrate the dynamism and glamour of 20th century urban American culture in all of its cutting-edge glory. The magazine's visual design was accordingly hyper-modern, casting out the fussy and cluttered ornate sensibilities of the Victorian age in favor of slick, minimalistic designs and bright color. Big, beautiful caricature illustrations would play a prominent role as well. Vanity Fair had three leading caricature artists, Miguel Covarrubias, Paul Garetto, and William Cotton, all young men who were heavily influenced by the Cubist and Art Deco movements that had become such a big deal at that time. You can see this reflected in their preference for geometric shapes and bright colors. Miguel Covarrubias was probably the most famous and talented. He was born in Mexico, and a lot of his art is evocative of the equally experimental Mexican mural movement that was arising at the same time in that country. I love this drawing of his, which depicts a young Ernest Hemingway rubbing hair growth tonic on his chest. Or this one of the explorer Admiral Byrd having another lonely Christmas at the South Pole. Or this one of the famously sex-obsessed psychiatrist Sigmund Freud interviewing the actress Jean Harlow, one of the leading sex symbols of the time. One of Miguel Covarrubias's friends was a guy named Albert Hirschfeld, who had a very distinctively abstract style of his own, which he claimed was heavily influenced by the indigenous art of Indonesia. Where the other great Jazz Age caricaturists embraced colorful shapes, Hirschfeld preferred to render his subjects entirely in elaborately flowing lines, as in this portrait of Judy Garland, or this one of Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. Hirschfeld loved the theater, and his big thing became drawing illustrative caricatures of the casts of Broadway shows for the New York Times. He started doing this in the 1920s, and amazingly enough, continued for almost 80 years, drawing his last caricature in 2003, before dying at age 99. By the 1930s, America had really gone nuts for caricature, which was seen as this very modern and fun style of art, appropriate for celebrating America's first glory age of celebrity. Not only did caricatures become a mainstay of magazines and newspapers, they'd be seen on movie posters or murals at theaters, even hanging on the walls of restaurants. During World War II, caricature fell into what is now regarded as a bit of a dark age, given how often it was used to push propaganda, often by leaning into racial stereotypes. The Polish-American artist Arthur Szake is often regarded as one of the best caricaturists of the war era for his hyper-detailed, almost fresco-like renditions of both Axis leaders like Hitler and his henchmen, as well as Allied ones like Britain's George VI. But when you looked at how he depicted anyone Japanese, it was little better than a Bugs Bunny cartoon. After the war, however, and particularly during the 1960s and 70s, caricature had another golden age of creativity and innovation. As had been the case at the start of the century, the 60s and 70s were a time of considerable churn and tumult in the world of ideas, and this bred interest in new styles of art to communicate these new ideas. In Great Britain, a young illustrator named Gerald Scarfe sought to capture what he saw as the chaos of his time with caricatures of public figures that were aggressively repulsive, gory, and often highly sexual. Check out this one that depicts the increasingly unpopular Jackie Kennedy with her second husband, the Greek tycoon Aristotle Onassis. Or this one of a pregnant Pope Paul VI, who had shocked the world by coming out against birth control. Sir Ian Fleming as James Bond is probably too dirty to show. Scarfe would go on to have a very long career as one of the world's leading caricaturists, dabbling in all sorts of different mediums, from intensely detailed ink portraits to light and breezy watercolors to even sculpture. In 1963, a magazine known as the New York Review of Books was created, and they hired a man named David Levine to serve as their in-house caricaturist. You could easily argue he might be the single most influential caricaturist of the last century, just given how wildly his style has been imitated and copied. Levine always worked in black and white, creating elaborately cross-hatched renderings of the top political, literary, and entertainment celebrities of his age, with big heads, little bodies, and subtle props to indicate the nature of their personalities and obsessions. Like, check out this one of the famously combative writer Norman Mailer, depicted as a boxer, or this one of the Russian dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, getting a sickle to the neck. This might be his most famous drawing of all, depicting President Lyndon Johnson exposing a Vietnam-shaped scar on his belly. When Johnson became Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1968, Levine drew him for the cover. Mad magazine, which was founded in 1955, similarly helped make celebrities out of two other young caricaturists, Mort Drucker and Jack Davis. For many years, they drew satirical strips for the magazine, mocking politicians and celebrities. Both of these men, who had quite similar, quite detailed styles, reflecting high levels of technical competence, became some of the major cartoon artists of their time, drawing not only comic strips for Mad, but also magazine covers, and, like the Jazz Age caricaturists before them, movie posters. If you are a fan of screwball comedies from the late 70s or early 80s, chances are you have probably seen a drawing by Drucker or Davis. As the 1980s and then 90s rolled around, caricature became a highly lucrative type of art to get into if you wanted to make a living as a professional illustrator in America. This was because the 80s and 90s turned out to be a golden era of magazine journalism, as publications like GQ, Esquire, Vogue, Rolling Stone, The New Yorker, and good old Vanity Fair became bigger, grander, and glossier as they sought to service the needs of that heroically consumerist age. This in turn begat demand for high-quality caricature artists to provide artistic supplements to the often lengthy profiles and interviews of the many new glamorous public figures who arose during those decades. The American painter Philip Burke was one such guy who emerged to offer his services. His enormous caricatures painted on giant canvases were incredibly ambitious and expressive, combining wild, unnatural colors with surreal twists and contortions of the human form. This one of Kurt Cobain is a personal favorite of mine, along with this one of David Bowie. You can tell that he is a man clearly inspired by the great abstract artists of the early 20th century. Another star was Sebastian Kruger, a German artist whose incredibly formal style has been widely imitated but rarely matched. Kruger's art sought to answer the question, what if human beings actually looked like caricatures? His response was to combine extreme comic exaggerations of the body with highly realistic renderings of anatomy, creating paintings that are often hilarious, but often fairly nightmarish as well. I've always liked this one he did of Arnold Schwarzenegger. He so carefully renders all of the weird muscles in this one little bit of Arnold's back in order to play up the grotesqueness of his overdeveloped physique, which is of course his most iconic feature. A similar technique was employed by two artists in Britain, Peter Fluck and Roger Law. They created these elaborate and often disturbing plasticine caricatures of public figures that were then photographed and used as magazine illustrations. In 1984, the two men were given their own show on British television, featuring caricature puppets done up in the style of their art. It became one of the most iconic shows of the Thatcher years in the UK. On the other end of the caricature spectrum, meanwhile, you had much milder, more cheerful artists like David Cowles and Robert Risco, who had styles that were more evocative of some of the early 20th century guys, like Covarrubias. Cowles made his caricatures out of brightly colored geometric shapes that had little interest in being accurate reflections of human anatomy, as opposed to just capturing the joyful essence of their persona, as in this one of Stevie Wonder, or this one of Steve Jobs. Robert Risco, meanwhile, used the airbrush to create these really soft, pastel, Art Deco-looking portraits that were for a time very ubiquitous in 90s magazines. I like this one of Dolly Parton and this one of Spike Lee. But perhaps the most innovative of all was the Israeli artist Hanoch Piven, whose caricatures were literal collages that used physical objects like toys and office supplies to create brilliant works that were full of in-jokes and symbolism. Like, check out this one of Barbra Streisand, where her famously big nose is a microphone, or this one of Saddam Hussein, where his iconic mustache is a row of matches. In the 2000s, however, the art of caricature began to decline. Many of the great pioneers, like Hirschfeld and Levine, simply died, while others, like Gerald Scarfe, were just getting old and worn out. And as more publications migrated to the internet, which favored a faster turnaround time from writing to publishing, there was also a decline in demand for time-consuming graphics more broadly. It wasn't just caricaturists. Illustrators and photographers both claim to have seen a declining demand for their services over the last 20 years as well. And some of it is, of course, just changing tastes. The fact that you don't see caricatures on magazine covers or movie posters very much these days presumably has at least something to do with consumer data that suggests they just don't move product the way they used to. Which isn't to say we haven't seen the rise of any new talents. The Spanish artist Maria Picasso y Piqué, for instance, uses the computer to make these really striking minimalistic portraits that she calls constructivist caricatures.